you all here this afternoon to our Irish Studies seminar series, in which obviously we're doing something different today. We're doing a book launch. The format for today is we're going to have two shortish talks by myself and by Ruth. And then we will adjourn to the other side of the room where there are refreshments, alcoholic and non-alcoholic. So please, if you can, stay and to have a drink and celebrate with Ruth on the publication of her book. So it's with a great honor and pleasure for me to be able to introduce this really very important and timely new book that we're launching today, Healthcare and the Troubles, the Conflict Experience of the Northern Ireland Health Service, 1968 to 1998, published by Liverpool University Press. I believe it's going to make a significant contribution to our understanding of the period of civil conflict here that we label the Northern Ireland Troubles. Ruth will say something more about her methods and her approaches to the book. I'm going to kind of give you a summary and an overview of what the book is about and perhaps some of its principal themes. So we hope we don't overlap too much in what we have to say. So I think it's unnecessary to remind an audience here in Belfast of the traumatic impact of our conflict that stretched over 3 decades, from the civil rights marches of 1968 to the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, and also importantly the Omagh bombing of summer 1998, which plays a significant role in Ruth's book. A conflict which continues to cast a long shadow of unresolved legacy issues through to the present, of which we're all more than sufficiently aware. Political violence in this society took 3,700 lives, and at a conservative estimate left over 40,000 physically injured, perhaps as high as 100,000, depending, because these figures were not fully kept at the time or subsequently, but at least 40,000 physically injured in a small society in which atrocity and counter-atrocity was both intimate and neighbourly, with a security infrastructure that was pervasive and intrusive, and in which the rhythms of everyday life were disrupted and punctuated by fear and terror. Now, of course, we have an enormous academic literature on the conflict from multiple disciplinary perspectives, but remarkably, given that traumatic death, injury, and lasting physical and mental scarring were at the heart of the Troubles experience, scholarly discussion of its impact on the health service and on health professionals has been minimal until now. So Ruth Duffy's new book is the first to offer an overview of how the health service in the North was structured and prepared, or rather unprepared, for the storm that would break in the late 1960s and afterwards, how it responded to the sudden and extreme upsurge of violence in the following years, how the concepts of medical neutrality and impartiality and medical ethics more generally were challenged by the upheaval, and how both practitioners and the general public were impacted at the time and retrospectively by the stresses and traumas of violence and its legacies. To address the challenge in the book, Ruth has adopted complementary historical methods, working patiently through the ministerial records and reports held at the Public Record Office here in Belfast, press coverage over an extended period, and has added, really interesting and importantly, a series of structured oral history interviews with medical staff from hospitals and community practices across the province. That's something you're going to say a bit more about, Ruth. So I'll limit myself really to outlining some of the principal themes and findings that she draws our attention to in the book. The devolution of health policy to the Northern Ireland government from 1921 meant the history of health provision, and from 1948 of the National Health Service in the North, overlaps with but was never identical to the rest of the United Kingdom. This may explain some of the neglect of Northern Ireland from general histories of the NHS. Throughout the 20th century, Northern Ireland tended to top the tables for indicators of poor public health, interconnected with high levels of structural inequality, poverty, and substandard housing. So there are these underlying challenges which predate the Troubles, And these, combined with the absence of effective planning for the sort of civil emergency that would manifest itself from August 1969, meant that health institutions here were already under significant strain when that crisis happened. With limited additional funding until 1972, it was remarkable that the system coped at all, due largely, as Ruth relates, to the dedication and commitment of its health professionals. The book does not shy away from the profound problems of a medical system maintaining a real and perceived neutrality amid conditions of acute communal polarization and struggles for control over physical space. These pose major challenges to both the aspirations to maintain medical immunity from violence and impartiality in the provision of care under conditions of emergency. Nominally, medical provision should be legally protected under the Geneva Conventions, but in Northern Ireland conditions, obviously with an undeclared war, this was virtually a dead letter. Ruth draws attention to episodes where medical immunity was not respected, involving several IRA murders of NHS staff on hospital property, with the victims being part-time or former security force personnel, as well as several sectarian attacks by loyalists on staff and patients in hospitals. While these were exceptional, a number of attacks on security force personnel, including bombings in and around the hospital estate, unquestionably placed patients and staff in real danger and indicated, she observes, a lack of respect for medical immunity. On the other hand, the presence of military personnel at highly sensitive locations, especially Belfast Royal Victoria Hospital, on what were alleged to be surveillance operations, drew allegations that the site had been militarized and hence a legitimate target. The impartiality of the NHS was further compromised by a legal requirement from 1967 that staff report treatments for gunshot and explosive injuries to the RUC, a stipulation that drew political protests and a practice of transferring injured Republican paramilitaries across the border for treatment, sometimes with fatal consequences. Despite these violations of medical neutrality, and the added problem that in the early years of the Troubles, the senior ranks of the service, although not its nursing and ancillary staff, were seen as predominantly Protestant, it appears clear that most staff placed a high value on assuring impartial treatment of all victims, irrespective of communal identity and of victim-perpetrator status, and of sometimes having to repress personal feelings in doing so. Nevertheless, the fear of attending certain sites and wider sectarianism in the community did lead to the need to duplicate services between hospitals, especially in Belfast. Even more acute ethical questions were posed for medical staff engaging more directly with the state through the criminal justice and prison systems. The introduction of internment in 1971 drew allegations of systematic mistreatment generally, and especially of a selected number of internees subjected to, quote, deep interrogation. Doctors asked to examine such detainees were faced with the choice of speaking out over state abuses or engaging in complicity through silence. And the book traces evidence for both options, noting that communal identity was a poor indicator of what choice would be taken by any individual doctor. Public complaints from medical professionals such as Dr. Patrick Lane and later the Police Surgeons Association would be taken up by inquiries and ultimately feed into the discussions that led to the 1975 World Medical Association's Tokyo Declaration, which sought to prohibit professional involvement in or condoning torture or degrading treatment of detainees or prisoners. Similar controversies were stoked by the use of riot control agents such as CS gas and of rubber and plastic baton rounds, the latter criticised by 4 surgeons at the Royal Victoria Hospital as early as 1972 in a report that was first suppressed and then ignored by the government. As the prison estate expanded rapidly in the 1970s and 80s and became the site of major confrontations between paramilitary prisoners and the prison authorities, it was again inevitable that the medical profession was drawn into what Ruth describes as a dual loyalty challenge. If early charges of selective negligence may have been largely politically motivated, the escalation of systematic protests in Northern Ireland prisons from 1976 onwards heightened tensions. The mandating of forced baths on health grounds by prison doctors during the dirty protest was regarded as collusion with the state. At the onset of hunger strikes in 1980 and 1981, following earlier episodes in jails in Great Britain, attracted sustained debates between professionals on the medical ethics of permitting death by starvation as opposed to coerced force feeding. In the end, this tactic was not adopted in Northern Ireland, although it was in Great Britain. And the humane treatment of hunger striking prisoners by the prison medical staff, led by Dr. David Ross, appears to have assuaged much of the previous hostility. Ross's suicide in 1986, linked to his experience of overseeing the 10 deaths in the maze in 1981, might be regarded as another outcome of the hunger strikes. If treatment of the belligerents of the Troubles was the most direct and complex way in which the conflict impacted on the National Health Service, it was merely the tip of the iceberg. The sustained disruption of society, often concentrated in and around major urban hospital sites such as the Royal Victoria Hospital, Musgrave Park Hospital, and the Mater, complicated the day-to-day lives of health staff and ordinary patients alike. And this extended beyond the work. This extended beyond to the work of ambulance staff, GPs, and community health workers in the community. Financially, the additional cost of acute and trauma treatment placed a huge burden on the regional NHS, with the budget rising from under £60 million per annum in 1972-3 to £1.2 billion by 1992-3. And while much of this could be leveraged, albeit with significant delays from the UK government, it also meant transfer of resources within the service towards A&E and ICU provision and away from ordinary chronic treatments and the patients who depended upon these. Duplication, for reasons already mentioned, also imposed additional costs, as did the extended building disruptions produced by the Troubles, as with the infamous Belfast City Hospital tower block, which kind of looms behind us just over there in the 1970s. Moving on to legacies, Ruth weighs up the evidence for and against the war is good for medicine thesis as it relates to Northern Ireland. Certainly some areas of treatment received boosts for investment in research and equipment, rendered in the areas rendered most in demand under Troubles conditions. Medical specialisms relating to traumatic injuries, including in the plastic, thoracic, neurosurgery, and microsurgery fields, became evident, especially in the Royal Victoria Hospital and the Ulster Hospital. Demands for physical trauma treatment did not end in 1998, with the continuing frequency of paramilitary punishment attacks maintaining need for extensive orthopedic and rehabilitation care thereafter, right up to the present. Now, set against this was a reluctance to commit funding to long-term physical rehabilitation and, above all, to mental health care. Only very late in the Troubles, in the wake of the Omagh bombing in 1998, was mental health, where the mental health consequences of violent trauma given proper consideration. But it remains a woefully underfunded element of health spending in Northern Ireland. A 2015 report found that 60% of all mental health problems associated with the Troubles had not received treatment, while for many others it was substandard, and that this was manifest in the very high levels of suicide with Troubles connections at a rate well above UK averages. Mental health issues relate not only to victims and their relatives, but also to medical staff who worked in the period, many of whom had sought to maintain high levels of neutrality despite witnessing scenes of extreme horror linked with symptoms of PTSD. In the absence of mental health supports, such staff had been dependent on camaraderie and teamwork spirit to maintain resilience, although the long-term costs of such normalizing strategies may have been underestimated. So summing up, I hope I've given you a sense of the kind of contents of the book. I think it is a really important book, shifting attention away from the self-promotion and apologetics of both belligerents and the state and party political actors, towards a focus on the consequences of sustained civil conflict on an essential part of civil society. It deals with both bureaucratic resource allocations and acts of harrowing violence, with the ethical dilemmas of medical professionals caught between state obligations and conscience, and with the coping mechanisms often featuring humour of the ordinary workers who did so much to keep society functioning at a time when so much appeared to be falling into an abyss of sectarianism and carnage. So I recommend the book to you most strongly. Unfortunately, we had hoped to, but we don't have books here to sell tonight. It is only available in hardback at the moment. We do have some flyers here, which will give you a 30% discount off the hardback price. That's still quite a significant amount. So if you'd like to buy a copy using the discount code directly from Liverpool University Press, please do so. But if you can't do that, what we really ask you to do is to order a copy for your library. The more library copies that are sold, the quicker the book will get into paperback and reach the audience that I think it really deserves here in Northern Ireland. So I'm speaking here to people online as well, spread across the world. Please order a copy of the book for your libraries and help us get this process of getting it paperbacked complete. So I'm going to finish there, and I'm going to pass over to Ruth, who's going to say a few words as well.
Thank you very much, Peter. That was a really nice overview. I thought I would just start by talking a little about my own interest in the topic and what kind of led to this book. And actually, it begins during my master's studies at Ulster University. And part of the course there was a module on the history of medicine. And I really loved that module. And I find it such an interesting area of history. Then fast forward a little bit, and I'm deciding what I want to do for my master's dissertation. And I'm thinking that I want to do something to do with the history of medicine, something to do with Northern Ireland, but I'm not exactly sure what I want. At this point, my sister Hannah starts to talk to me about Musgrave Park Hospital. My sister's over here standing. Hannah was just finishing her degree in occupational therapy and had been on a number of different placements. And she starts telling me about all the things she's hearing about Musgrave Park and how much the Troubles had helped the hospital, helped, very bad word to use, but helped the hospital become experts in orthopedics, prosthetics, rehabilitation. And this idea starts to go around in my head about this idea about the conflict being good for medicine, and how could this be true, or what was the reality? Was it much more nuanced? So my master's thesis then focused specifically on Musgrave Park, but whilst I was undertaking this research project, I realised that the health service much more widely during this period had not really been considered by historians at all, really. And I started to put together then a proposal for a PhD project based on the health service during the conflict. And I approached Leanne McCormick, who's also here today, to be my supervisor. But one of the issues I was having when I was planning this topic was finding the sources that would allow me to understand the experiences of those who had worked on the front line, so to speak, and what life was really like for them day to day. What was available in Prony or through newspapers or through medical journals, all which I do use in my book, but wasn't helping me understand the real life experiences. So Leanne suggested that I might consider using oral history to speak directly to those involved. And I must admit, I initially was not keen on this idea, which Leanne knows. I'm naturally quite a shy person, and the thought of meeting with strangers and talking to them about sensitive experiences in their own lives was a bit overwhelming to me. But Leanne encouraged me, and I'm very grateful that she did. And basically all the work I've done since then has involved oral history to some degree, so she was definitely right in that respect. But yes, so I went ahead and carried out my PhD thesis using all these sources from Prony, the newspaper archives, medical journals, but also oral history, structured interviews with members of staff from the health service. I finished my PhD then in 2021, and I did my viva at the end of April that year. My external examiner for that was Professor Laura Kelly from Strathclyde. And during the viva, Laura mentioned that the potential to turn this research into a book existed. And following on from my PhD viva, Leanne and Laura encouraged me and aided me in writing a proposal to Liverpool which was then of course accepted, and after a great deal of drafting and redrafting has led to this book. So that's basically the story of how we got to the book, but I just wanted perhaps to talk a little bit more about the oral history aspect of this project, because it's such an important part of this book. So I interviewed 29 former healthcare professionals, which included doctors, nurses, allied health professionals. And these individuals worked in hospitals or in the community at different locations across Northern Ireland. The benefits of using oral history as a source I've already really mentioned is with regards to getting this experience of those who lived and worked through that time. Of course, oral history brings with it challenges and has been looked down on many times by historians as a method. And one of these key challenges is the challenges of memory itself. An individual, of course, may remember an incident or event in their life, but this might not entirely add up to what a researcher can discover from other sources or other testimonies. And an interview might even be affected by the bias of the interviewer themselves or the interviewee, or by the retrospective knowledge of the past. But of course, how an individual remembers something can reveal much more, adding meaning to the memory. And considering the social context, and that despite the end of the conflict, that the Troubles still affects life in Northern Ireland today. And in consequence, I believe this memory of the past being politicised adds meaning to the memory. So in Northern Ireland, of course, despite being a shared past, we do not have a shared memory. Separate collective memories of the two communities have grown and developed, and these continue to be influenced by traditions, commemorations, and memorials. This is very much amplified by the passage of time. The real memories fade, and what people think happened becomes more important than what actually did occur. The different community backgrounds, therefore, of interviewees could influence to an extent what and how they remember these experiences during the conflict, which is something I touch on a bit in this book. I hope that the interviewees, the spread of interviewees from this book, would provide a good cross-section of the health service, not just in terms of the different roles, but also gender and religious or community affiliation, which is very much important here. But of course, discussing religion with individuals from Northern Ireland can be a challenge. And in terms of carrying out oral history interviews, you want to build a rapport, a relationship with your interviewees, and something as asking people about their religion or community could be very off-putting. So I decided that the best course of action was to avoid any sort of overt questions, which could reveal the interviewee's background, even questions such as where did you live or where did you go to school? Instead, individuals were asked a more open question about how and why they came to work in the health service. Some interviewees spoke about their upbringing, where they lived, their schooling. Other interviewees actually openly stated their religion or community affiliation. So based on this, I felt I had a good representative sample from both community groupings and people from outside those as well. In terms of the balance of genders, this was a little more difficult. Much more females than males were interviewed in this project. This was largely due to I had a lot more nurse interviewees than doctors. And at the time of the Troubles, the profession here in Northern Ireland was largely female. The opposite being the case with the doctors. I interviewed a total of 7 doctors for the study. 6 were male and 1 was female. Considering why many more nurses were interviewed, this was basically because more nurses were willing to take part. I contacted many other doctors asking them if they would take part in an interview, and many were unwilling to be involved. I could speculate as to why they didn't want to be involved, but I won't right now. Also, nurses often referred colleagues to me who they had worked with, suggesting that I might want to speak to them about their experiences. And this can be very much linked to the camaraderie and comradeship of the time. People develop close relationships with those they worked with, and they supported one another, which is something Peter has touched upon. They understood what each other was going through. So they had a great deal of respect for one another, and many of these relationships continue up until the present day. So in a larger sample, a larger study, a larger number of interviews, perhaps I would be possible to get a greater balance of the genders, greater balance of professions. But I feel in the scope of the number that I was able to undertake, it was a good representative of the period that was very much nursing female dominated at that time. In terms of where people worked, interviewees worked in hospitals and also some in the community. I attempted to get a spread of locations, and I have interviewees that come from many hospitals or communities across Northern Ireland. However, there is a concentration of interviewees, particularly around the Belfast hospitals, and particularly the Royal Victoria Hospital here in Belfast, and again also Altnagelvin Hospital in Derry, Londonderry. These locations has experienced many of the casualties of the conflict, and being within flashpoint areas of violence, there was a significant amount of experience related to the conflict, and therefore a lot of interviewees who came to speak to me spoke about their time working at these hospitals. I won't go into too much detail about the sort of questions I used or the sampling methods I used. I've kind of mentioned already about the comradeship and people referring one another. But if you're interested in this, it's in the introductory chapter. Go and read it. So I'm not going to spend time discussing the themes because Peter has done this wonderfully already. But there was just a few little things that I wanted to mention that struck me as being particularly important. Firstly, I want to start with a quotation from one of my interviewees. And he said, "Looking back on it, it seemed to me to be normal. You know, we would have regarded it as the norm. In fact, it was anything but normal. It was totally abnormal, but we regarded it as normal." So this particular quotation comes from a male nurse, actually, who worked in the community, both here in Belfast for a time and also over in Omagh. And I use this quotation at the start of my conclusion in this book because I feel it's very important to note how normalised working with violence became for many in the health service. Of course, this was also the case for many people living in Northern Ireland during this time. I've heard many stories from people about travelling to England or Dublin whilst the conflict was ongoing and being stopped in doorways, waiting in doorways in shops to be searched because this was such a normal experience here in Northern Ireland, but obviously very abnormal when you went anywhere else. But for some health service staff working day in and day out with seriously injured people, this became normal. One nurse who worked at the Royal spoke to me about student nurses and her realisation one day that a particular student nurse who she was working alongside had never witnessed a routine procedure, such as an appendectomy, but had only ever treated injured from bomb blasts or bullets. The consequences, of course, for this young student nurse could be numerous. Yes, she could be potentially gaining expertise in dealing with this particular type of injury or wound, but then she had a lack of knowledge in other important areas of her training. Then you add on to this the potential mental health consequences for her of seeing injured and dead who may be young, or perhaps known to her, or have died or been injured as a result of actions of other individuals. Mental health and support, available or not to medical staff, is something which is of great importance in this study, as well as attitudes which prevailed within the establishment or among staff themselves as to their perceived resilience and whether they should actually seek help. Many healthcare workers have been affected by their experiences. Mental health services more widely for Northern Ireland were lacking, and this issue remains today. The troubles have left many negative legacies, including this poor mental health, high suicide rates, and substance abuse. Something else which is quite important throughout this book is the idea of medical neutrality, which Peter has also talked about. The need for healthcare and the staff to appear neutral in the conflict. The challenges of doing this in a community where you're likely to be brought up on one side or the other, facing treating both the perpetrators and the victims of violence, and on occasions treating them side by side, as well as the negative consequences that occur if your neutrality was believed to be breached. Overall, it's important to note that generally respect was felt by all communities towards the health service throughout the time period and even since then. This, of course, can be contrasted with other services, such as housing, where communities have differing opinions to such. The health service is one of the few government departments which could boast that it had support from both sides. So finally, I just want to take a few minutes to thank a few people who have been very helpful in making this book possible. Firstly, thanks must go to Liverpool University professors and who have worked with me and guided me from a proposal to the final book that I now have, which is amazing. A great deal of thanks must there also go to the former health service staff who took their time to share their experiences with me. Without their contributions, this book would not have been possible, and I was very grateful for all their kindness and support as well as I worked through my PhD project and since. As this book started life as a PhD project, thanks are of course due to my supervisors from Ulster University and of course Professor Leanne McCormick, Her guidance, encouragement and support, even post-PhD, has been invaluable, and I'm really grateful. Also, again, to thank Professor Laura Kelly for her support and role in this process. Here at Queen's, I must thank Dr. Alison Garden, who's the PI on the project which I currently work on here. Alison has been a great support as I drafted and edited this book, encouraged me to take the time to work on this and to see it through to completion. And then finally, I'd just like to thank my family and friends who have supported and encouraged me throughout this process. I've already mentioned earlier some of the ways in which they have helped play key roles in my work. So many thanks are due to my parents, Elsie and Ralph, to my siblings, David, Hannah, Joanna, Susanna, and Jonathan. There's quite a few. My mother and father-in-law, Philip and Angela. And finally, special thanks to my husband, Sean, who has put up with me throughout the process and encouraged me to finish this and see it through to publication, despite also working on his own PhD at the same time. And then just thanks to Peter and Kathy from the Irish Studies Institute for putting on this book launch for me today. I'm very grateful for your support and continued support here at Queen's.
Ruth, would you be happy to take a few questions if anybody has any?
A few.
Short
Questions. Nice questions.
Do we have any questions from anybody in the room? Yes.
Hello.
I'm actually a public health student and was very keen to know as an international student the perception of entire medical healthcare landscape. And I just wanted to know, did you manage to interview any public healthcare officers or social workers, or did you get a chance to get their insights? Not the interview, but just random insights and what was their position, how they are working in advancing.
I didn't interview anyone who works in public health or social work. I did interview a few allied health professionals, but that was more physiotherapists, occupational therapists. I haven't got their insights, but I would be very interested in their thoughts on their experiences, which is obviously a slightly different area, but yeah, something that would be very interesting to look at perhaps in the future, and its other aspects of health and healthcare. Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, I had a question about sort of medical specialities. Do you find that, obviously because you were looking at a mixture of hospital medicine or as well as community medicine, did you find that certain specialities of medicine, for example, orthopedics, psychiatry, are massively like dominating your stories, particularly in terms of like patient and practitioner experience, or did you find that you've got a bit more sort of a overall general, because obviously there's lots of specialities from obstetrics to urology and cancers.
I find that people wanted to talk about things that they perceive to be benefiting, it's a very bad way, benefiting from, but in terms of orthopedics, that people are very keen to point out how they'd improve treatments. Same with neurosurgery, they wanted to talk about what they perceive to be the good coming out of the bad. In terms of specialties, as Peter discussed, some of the ways in which finances would have been diverted towards what was seen as acute issues, what was seen as needed to be treated right away, rather than people who were on waiting lists waiting for a hip replacement surgery. A lot of times wards would be cleared out because there had been an incident and some people were coming in as emergencies, and people would be sent home not getting their operation that they'd been scheduled for. So I hope that sort of answers, but yes, there is certain things that people bring up a lot, particularly plates for head injuries, neurosurgery, and also orthopedics and fixing of bones. But that's because those were things that were deemed to be seen as the good coming out of the bad, as medical advancements being made and it would be reported in the newspapers as being a medical advancement being made because of the experience of the conflict.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you, Sophie.
I was wondering about, was everyone that you interviewed from here, and did they remain here afterwards? This is partly prompted by a particularly ridiculous Silent Witness episode where Nikki finds out that her mum had been a nurse here and had an affair with an IRA guy because they were in such proximity. Sorry, spoiler alert. But the whole thing was that she was English and she came across to learn this expertise. not the right word, sleeping. This is obviously relating to your current research as well, with your love across the divide.
Yeah, it is. Yes, yes.
But yes, like
Yeah,
everyone from here.
there was at least one, I think it was one doctor that was English, but had lived here for a significant period, I think before, well, a few years before even the conflict had started. But pretty much everybody else had grown up in Northern Ireland. They might not necessarily still work in the area which they came from. Some people had grew up in Ards and had moved to Belfast to work because they trained at the Royal. But most of them, yeah, it was here and still here. A lot of people did actually leave. There was a few actually who had left and come back as well. During the conflict, they went to get away and then came back years later. But yeah, thank you. And I have to watch that now.
Spread the details. Yeah. Question at the back. Yeah.
It's really interesting. I suppose my question is, I remember whenever there was kind of a bomb, anybody with medical experience was encouraged to go to the site to be of assistance. So did you ever come across, like, I suppose, civilians who didn't anticipate getting into medicine, but because of the troubles and because of the kind of factors around them, ended up going into medicine because of what was happening? Like, did you come across any of that?
Into medicine. I mean, I interviewed people who had started their training a few years into the conflict. I think it was more that it hadn't put them off.
Okay.
You know, many people trained at the Royal. It was the big teaching hospital, but it was also in this very big flashpoint of violence in that area of the city. But yet, a lot of people still chose to go there to train because it was seen as the best place to train. They did have some issues with recruiting as the conflict went on in terms of getting people to come and work here, but in terms of people experiencing things and then go, I don't know if I could answer that. But yeah, they definitely, people still wanted to train and still work here despite everything that was going on.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea for this group, and I can't wait to read it.
Thank you.
But I was going to ask, did you sort of get a sense in the interviews how far, maybe you talked about the camaraderie between, say, nurses and doctors. How far did that maybe transcend the intercommunal kind of divide in Northern Ireland? And you know, did that come through in the interviews that maybe, say, if you know, one was a Catholic and one was a Protestant, if they were working together and seeing people's lives didn't really matter? How far did that kind of come across?
It came across quite a lot, actually, particularly among nurses. A lot of the nurses, particularly when they were training, would have lived in the nurses' home, which would be near the hospital. So they would have been sharing rooms, living together, working together. And a lot of people did talk about, oh, well, we didn't really care if, you know, you were a Protestant, you were a Catholic, that didn't really matter. And there was definitely some of the people I interviewed passed me on to their very good friends who, knowing names and backgrounds and where they live, I could assume, and some of them would have said that they had a different background. In fact, two nurses that I interviewed together who worked in the community in Belfast, one was a Protestant and one was a Catholic, and they chose to be interviewed together because they were most comfortable, even now, many years later, talking about their experience working at that time. But yeah, from two completely different backgrounds, but very good friends to the present day.
Liam?
Thanks, Ruth.
Thank you.
Yeah, I must admit, when I heard of another book on the Troubles, it wasn't exactly cheering. But then when I saw the title, I thought, gosh, that's a really, as Peter was saying, a really neglected dimension of the Troubles. So I think it's really important. One little question. I remember a conversation with a colleague some years ago whose partner, I think, was an ambulance driver. And she mentioned that it was particularly traumatic for ambulance drivers dealing with victims of punishment shootings, or beatings, usually shootings. And they knew when they were getting into the ambulance that the shooting was already taking place, was about to take place. And they were simply going to the alleyway to pick up the mess. Does the scope of your study and perhaps any oral history. So does it extend to ambulance drivers?
I do discuss some of the experiences of ambulance drivers, yes, particularly around their difficulties travelling into areas to get victims and leaving, or even other patients having to go into what was described as no-go areas, and the challenges of that, and how even the hospital service had to fit wire screens on the fronts of ambulances. And occasions, ambulances were not usually targeted specifically, but there was occasions where if they knew there was a soldier being carried on an ambulance, that the ambulance might have been shot. It did happen on a number of occasions. In terms of punishment shootings, yes, some people did discuss about the warning phone call being made. There's going to be someone with a gunshot wound and being sent to pick up this person who potentially, when the call came in, did not have a gunshot wound, but would have by the time they were collected. So yes, it did happen, definitely. Yeah. But there's definitely scope for much more exploration specifically of ambulance men and their experiences.
Yeah.
Congratulations, Ruth.
Thank you.
From a PhD supervisor, and I'm happy to ask all the questions. And just I took it from her first year, from her first undergraduate class in history, and I remember very well. She's very quiet, and so this is. And then I got her written work, and I thought she absolutely was taking it on. She also broke 8th grade class, which is she did very well in that module. But I just wondered whether the PhD and turning it into a book and the whole process, whether you've got to this point. I think you're probably the second you don't open the book in case you see, so you can see any mistakes they're there and all those things. But I just wonder if you're reflecting on the process and everything that's in the book. Are there things that didn't make the book from the PhD? Are there areas where you think, oh, I wish I'd been able to do a bit more in that, or so where is it sitting with you right now?
Yeah. Well, as you know, Leanne, the PhD was massive, probably slightly too big. So yeah, a lot of decisions had to be made about cutting, which I found very hard because I wanted it all to go in. So there's certain things that you'll probably notice when you read it, if you read it, that it's different. There's definitely areas. Alice and I were talking about this earlier, about potential future grants.
Don't give away your idea.
Yes, I'm not going to tell anyone what I'm thinking, but there's a few areas that we were talking about that I want to look at more fully, or things I've even discovered since looking at other things and that I want to explore a bit more. But yeah, in terms of it had to the redrafting was hard, because I was very happy with the PhD as it was, but it just wasn't going to go directly into a book. But yeah, but I'm very happy with it. But I'm sure there's typos and things that I will notice that I don't like once I look at it.
Okay, any questions online, Luke? No? Okay, last one from the room. Yeah.
Ruth, I am going to be cheeky. I'm a bit biased because I was a nurse in the Royal.
Yeah.
During the Troubles, and I've done part of that's been my master's. And I met you to explore, seeing that your book was coming online. I suppose I'm being cheeky and you may not choose to share it, but what suggestions might you make for further research?
The big thing for me is the mental health here in Northern Ireland, not just specifically the Troubles, but very much affected by the Troubles. I think there's a lot more work that could be done on the experiences in terms of mental health, and even just specifically for healthcare professionals here. There's so, as we were talking about the ambulance men, that's another big area that I touch on, but really you could have a whole project that just looks at their specific experience, because theirs is very much a different and unique experience as well. So there's plenty of avenues. There's loads more, but I'm not going to tell you about them. But yes, loads. And
you want to give away all your secrets?
No.
Great. Thank you all so much for coming and participating. It's been a really great event. I'm absolutely delighted to be able to do this, to launch this wonderful book. So apologies again, we don't have copies here, except for Ruth's own personal copy. So if you would like to come and look at the book, you won't mind people kind
I
of
don't mind looking, no.
flicking through it.
Just don't steal it.
At the front. Don't take it away, please. We do have some flyers here at the front. So if you want one for yourself or for an institution, please come and take one. There's a reduction code on that. So I think it just it's just for me to again ask you to congratulate Ruth on publishing her first monograph. And we have refreshments, so please stay and join us and have a glass of something and have a chat with Ruth.
Oh, thank you.